This is Shannon with Unique Arts, and welcome back. Today, I'm going to be talking a bit about one of my favorite people in history, at least one of my favorite people to study, and that is Barnett Newman. I'm doing this video at the request of someone. I did make a Barnett Newman video in the past, which is just a very general overview of his work and the artist himself, and I'll put a link for that in the description. Today, I'm going to be talking explicitly on his writings and his interviews. This is a book actually published in the 90s, pretty much taken from his wife, Anna Lee Newman. She had collected everything throughout his life, throughout his career and whatnot, even after he died, and they compiled all his writings and interviews into this. So it's just Barnett Newman selected writings and interviews, and this is pretty much where I'm getting all the information from for this video. It's a few hundred pages long, it's a bit detailed. I can't dive into everything, but I'll try to cover most interesting stuff in my opinion, at least generally speaking, because there are other things that people might find that, people vary. And what I like about this one is that this is from 98. It was Anna Lee Newman, the Barnett Newman's wife, actually signed it, gave it as a gift to someone who I guess didn't hold on to it. How rude, but I have it now. Mary Ann's stepdaughter, if you're out there, I appreciate you at least not being interested, I guess, because now I have this. But yeah, Barnett Newman. The writings and interviews, it gives you a brief overview initially by Richard Schiff. He's actually one of the chief scholars on Barnett Newman today. He actually wrote one of the two essays in the exhibition on Barnett Newman about 20 years ago at the Philadelphia Museum of Art with Ann Timken, who's now one of the chief curators at Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And that's a great read. I'd highly recommend that as well. He gives you an idea of some general overview stuff about Newman before getting into his writings. And now lots of those writings are separated. The interviews is the last section and such like that. And there's lots of letters he wrote to certain people, like Clement Greenberg, who's like pretty much the chief art historian, art patron really, or critic for the 1940s, 1950s, 60s era. Very important when you get to like contemporary art history. But Newman was actually a child of immigrants. He was born in 1905 in New York City. He lived in New York his whole life, and I've never been to New York. But he was a philosophy student. He studied philosophy at college, and that might also give you an idea of how he's like. But as far as Newman is known, his character, he's known for that stubbornness of spirit and integrity of soul, as Richard Schiff says. And I think that's pretty accurate. Now, his works are full of some sort of contradictions, there's a lot of irony, some sort of juxtapositions, and he elaborates on some things more than others, but they're not necessarily connected explicitly to what he's wrote in the past, because, well, writing's not his main thing. He's an artist, he's a painter and sculptor. There's an idea that Richard Schiff gives in the introduction for this book, and that it's the writings and the painting that make the man, that make Barnett Newman who he is. And that's something that Newman actually touches on a few times throughout his life, and that is that the writing affects the writer, the painting should affect the painter, and that it's not necessarily vice versa as we normally think about it. And I mean, it's kind of a give and take reciprocal relationship. Something he talks about a bit is one of the sections is even artist as critic, and that he had a problem with lots of his contemporary critics. He didn't think they were authentic or honest enough. That largely came down to, he thought that lots of critics were trying to create a work of science or a work of art with their own criticism. And it's, well, first off, he thought essentially it's not their job to create a work of art, and it's kind of them being just a poor journalist in his ideas. And if they're trying to make a work of science with their criticism, then it's just a bourgeoisie activity. He thought that neither of those are appropriate. The term he used is projective criticism, which he bothers from Meyer Shapiro, who's an art historian that he was acquainted with, one of his friends. They shouldn't create a work of science or create a work of art. They should create themselves. They essentially need to be projecting themselves in their own art criticism, and that's how you get authenticity, and that's how you get real criticism, stuff worth reading, essentially. He thought that they need to create themselves, but it doesn't mean that stopped him from criticizing people who he still disagreed with, even if they were being themselves. In fact, one of his letters, his correspondences, is to a guy, Mr. Washburn, who is the director for the Pittsburgh International Art Show. He was saying that essentially Mr. Washburn has decided already who the winners of these awards and whatnot are going to be from the International, rather than the judges themselves, because he gets to choose who's invited, and he only invites people that meet his personal interests. So even when people are at least being true to themselves and what they like, if it's not as necessarily as open as Newman thinks it should be, he'll still criticize you. In fact, to show his sense of humor in that regard, he sent a letter to Mr. Washburn, or at least to the committee for the Pittsburgh International, and attached a $500 check to create an award in his name for the Barnett Newman Award for the best artist not invited to the Pittsburgh International, so that the judges actually get to choose something that they think fits, not someone that Mr. Washburn picked to be invited. He's all about criticism, but he still has a heavy hand in his personal taste and what he thinks matters and what's important to him. And so, and what he thinks is important and what he thinks should be important to most people is, again, authenticity. The most authentic emotion, according to Newman, is terror. And this is part of the reason you get this influence of primitive art, and you see this a lot with modernism, is that, and part of the reason Newman appreciated primitive art, specifically art of the South Seas, oceanic art, is because primitive art is more honest, and that it actually expresses that terror, while we like to not talk about it or, act like we don't experience it in some regards, and we kind of do things in a roundabout way, at least in his day and age he thought we did. Newman believed that art should not focus on formal or representational conventions. Art should be true to modern conditions. We're not just copying the formal traditions of the people that came before us and the representational ideas. We're not copying that Renaissance tradition. We need to be true to ourselves. We need to be true to our day. Now, at the same time, goes against that Greek and Renaissance tradition, but at the same time, he kind of gives credence to the Greek tradition because one of the most important things to him in his art is politics, is political ideas. But at the same time, he says that we shouldn't do political ideas that are super common, that are super obvious, and kind of just the fads of the day, because then we're just being dogmatic. It's too easy. It's not authentic. He's really picky, if you can't tell, about what matters. So I mean, lots of this art today about LGBTQ communities and Black Americans and minorities and what have you, these are big conversations in the political sphere, at least in the United States, and I think most Western countries, and he would say that it's too easy, that you're just being dogmatic. And so you shouldn't do it. Avoid it, because you're not being true to yourself. Because being true to yourself would be doing what genuinely interests you, not necessarily doing what is obviously just a trend. One of his ideas, and he wrote several essays, some of them are much longer than others. The plasmic image, the one I'm mentioning now, is probably one of his longest ones. It's quite interesting. It's divided into several different parts, 12 parts. They're quite short. If you're acquainted with art history, then you will be acquainted with the idea of plasticity, or the plastic image, as Barnett Newman calls it, and his essay is called The Plasmic Image. And so it's kind of this other side of the same coin that he's saying needs to be more prevalent within, the act of creation for painting and for artists. Plastic is plastic, so it's inert, it's more passive, while plasmic would be more organic, so it's like the decorative compared to the philosophical. It needs to include more than looking beautiful, essentially, or looking pleasing to the eye. He doesn't really subscribe to the notion of beauty and the Greek and Renaissance tradition. It's more original thoughts and ideas are what can create that plasmic nature that makes the painting more worthwhile. Now, obviously, take of this what you will. I think in some regards, that's partially what makes movements like abstract expressionism hard to grasp, is because to really understand it, you need to read the readings, and that's kind of a lot of work, especially if you want to get acquainted with a lot of artists. I'm not exactly sure where a perfect middle ground is, because Barnett Newman wouldn't have there be a middle ground. He would just say that the best way to do it is this way. But the plasmic image is one of those ideas that was really important to Newman, and he explains just here in this last sentence or two of the essay that the new pictures are therefore philosophic. In handling philosophic concepts which per se are of an abstract nature, it was inevitable that the painter's form should be abstract, in the sense that these pictures try to say something, that is, that they have a subject. It was equally inevitable that the abstract form should have surrealist overtones. And so how they're essentially, abstract expressionists were kind of descended from the surrealists because they were abstract, but at the same time there was a degree of realism to them. But with these philosophical thoughts and ideas that should be originating from the artist, he's saying it's natural that they're going to be expressed in an abstract way. He thinks that these organic and philosophic ideas are essentially a rejection of that tradition, the Renaissance tradition, and with that authenticity, and not only with the primitive cultures like the archaic Greek or before that, he means pretty much forever, for all of human history. In fact, that kind of correlates to one of his other essays called The First Man Was an Artist, and that we're being true to the human origins and human heritage as a whole by abandoning this Renaissance tradition and this Greek tradition, because it's kind of too erudite and it's too self-centered. It's almost that the Greek tradition is too concerned with this notion of beauty and loses the genuine philosophical ideas that get overshadowed by beauty, and it's not authentic. It's essentially that they're full of themselves. The Greeks, at least the Athenians and whatnot, are full of themselves, and so what they have to offer is pretty much a waste of time. And I guess you wouldn't have that notion if it hadn't been adopted by the Renaissance tradition. But it's still an interesting notion. And so this is also from The First Man Was an Artist, but just a paragraph or so. Man's first expression, like his first dream, was an aesthetic one. Speech was a poetic outcry rather than a demand for communication. Original man, shouting his consonants, did so in yells of awe and anger at his tragic state, at his own self-awareness, and at his own helplessness before the void. Philologists and semioticians are beginning to accept the concept that if language is to be defined as the ability to communicate by means of signs, be they sounds or gestures, then language is an animal power. Anyone who has watched the common pigeon circle his female knows that she knows what he wants. The human in language is literature, not communication. Man's first cry was a song. Man's first address to a neighbor was a cry of power and solemn weakness, not a request for a drink of water. Even the animal makes a futile attempt at poetry. Ornithologists explain the cock's crow as an ecstatic outburst of his power. The loon gliding lonesome over the lake, with whom is he communicating? The dog alone howls at the moon. Are we to say that the first man called the sun and the stars God as an act of communication, and only after he had finished his day's labor? The myth came before the hunt. The purpose of man's first speech was an address to the unknowable. His behavior had its origins in his artistic nature. First Man Was an Artist is quite an interesting one, and that essentially he's saying that we should go back to that. The first man was an artist, or was a true artist, and that we need to be an artist, and it's not necessarily the way you think of it, and that Renaissance tradition has corrupted us with what we think is art. And I think it's really, really interesting, actually, that the first man was an artist, that he says that as humans we are different than these animals, but one of the most important things that differentiates us is this idea of communication. Like, that's not the point necessarily. Other animals do that, but humans don't necessarily do it simply to communicate. We don't use speech or language to communicate, or literature. We do it to create. We do it to create art. The aesthetic ideas come first before communicative ideas, according to Newman. He doesn't elaborate on this. This is not a very long thing, but I think it's something that's worth elaborating on. I'm not sure how much critical theory there has been pumped into this. What those first men, first people, the primitive peoples that, up to that Greek tradition, and many cultures that coincide with the Greeks, is that they have this authenticity to them, and so they have this sublimity about them. They have this access to the sublime. What Barnett Newman is pretty much his most famous paper, it's only a few pages long, it's called The Sublime Is Now. We have rejected the Renaissance tradition, and he explicitly states that it's in America, that America isn't burdened by this tradition of beauty as Europe is, and so that it's essentially easier for the American school to do it, for the New York school, the abstract expressionists, to do this, but they have brought back the sublime, or brought it to the forefront again within art. And he goes and he praises the Impressionists in this essay about destroying the notion of beauty. And now what his one problem with the Impressionists is that they destroy this notion of beauty, but beauty's not the only thing that takes away from the sublime, that there are other elements that are kind of ignored, and that this element of beauty in a way becomes, or this ugliness becomes, its own form of plasticity, kind of embraced in the arts. So in a way it doesn't really work, it doesn't really distance itself so much, but in a way he praises it because it's kind of a beginning towards modernism in the arts, and towards distancing itself from that Renaissance tradition. Distancing itself from that Renaissance tradition is largely found in subject matter. Subject matter is huge to Newman. He mentions it kind of consistently. Richard Schiff touches on it a lot in the introduction for this book. Actually, according to Schiff, the subject matter of Newman's paintings, which might be hard to discover if you're especially not acquainted to Newman's paintings, is freedom coupled with terror and tragedy. And so again, that terror is the most authentic human emotion. When we're experiencing terror, we're not clouded with this sense of civilization or whatever that might corrupt us from the earliest days. And so that sense of freedom in his American setting is kind of connected back to that sublimity, and then coupled with that sense of terror tragedy connects him back to that first man was an artist, the primitive nature. And so it aligns with this idea that subject matter should be in the defense of human dignity. That's pretty broad, but that's something that Newman himself mentions in his writings, that subject matter should be in the defense of human dignity. Part of that too, and part of that human dignity is originality, and being sincere and authentic is kind of being your own man. He's really interested in this kind of dichotomy between individuality and universal elements. That there are kind of universal motifs, universal language is kind of abstraction, but at the same time, individuality is still quite important to him. And so he kind of has this weird middle ground. He really, for example, he really hates capitalism, but he really hates totalitarianism as well, Marxism. He hates it all, pretty much. He actually is a proponent for anarchy. And so, as far as that is concerned, he wants art to be an original thought. You need to make your own art. He even explicitly says this. You shouldn't copy him. This is what happened with the minimalist. They copied his aesthetic a lot, but they didn't copy his ideas really at all. But people will still group them together. But he doesn't even, regardless of not copying his ideas, he doesn't want his aesthetic to be copied either. And so don't copy him. You can be influenced by him though. And so he says that we will be influenced. It's impossible to not be influenced by people. Even openly rejecting a Renaissance tradition is still being influenced by that Renaissance tradition in some degree. But that influence should be measured so that we can make sure that our own aesthetic is in fact our own. And that ultimately comes down to this idea that it needs to be your own. It connects with the idea that art is for searchers and for creators. You're not deemed the creator if you're just mimicking someone, if you're just copying someone, but you need to be a genuine searcher for truth and for these unique ideas, these original ideas. And you need these original thoughts. You shouldn't be a copyist and a sentimentalist as far as just mimicking these past traditions like it happened with the Renaissance, and continued for hundreds of years. Or even with the Renaissance, just mimicking the classical tradition. Another idea of his that I kind of mentioned, he really didn't like capitalism or totalitarianism. He was really not a fan of art of nations. There is no such thing as an art of nations. There's only such thing as an art of people, of specific people. He genuinely thought that nationalistic art missed the point of art, that they just don't know what they're doing, essentially. Take that as you will. I think in some regards, things like the Celtic Revival or all these indigenous Renaissance, like the Maori Renaissance and what have you, are kind of nationalistic in tone, but at the same time, they're incredibly important to these specific individuals, and he doesn't really quite explain how to balance that. Part of the reason too, again, with that, an artist isn't a group of people, an artist is an individual. Who cares about the group in that regard, or who cares about the cosmos? He specifically said, we are at peace with the universe, but we are not at peace with ourselves. He thinks that is part of the modern tradition. Well, when Thomas Hess tells him that he thinks that you have an identity problem, Barnett Newman responds and says, I think we all do. And maybe that's a 1950s, 1960s way of thinking about it, but he genuinely thought we all had identity problems, and that art is a way for us to reconcile ourselves with ourselves. We don't need reconciliation with the universe, or maybe we will need more of it later, but we don't need to worry about that now at least. Part of that idea comes with this idea of still being true to your generation and to your time. Newman wrote a paper on these ideas that the terror is an element present in most primitive art cultures, and he mentions 3 specific ones, and he talks about what provides that terror for those people. South Seas and Oceania, that the terror came from the unseen forces. And then in Africa, he said it comes from the jungle, like what animals lie in the jungle. And for the American Indian, he said it was other men, it was other people, other tribes. He said for modern man is his own terror. We're not afraid of the unknown. We're not afraid of other tribes necessarily. I think at least especially in this day and age, how disconnected are we from military conflict as far as the average person is, especially in the West. But we're afraid of ourselves. Our own terror is ourselves. And maybe you could see that in its own ways through all the anxiety and depression issues and the drug problems, opioid problems we have in the world. That's just one thought. The idea is art should deal with the individual, specifically the art shouldn't deal with the artist who's creating it, but also that art is metaphysical, and so artists are dealing with metaphysical aspects, again, that philosophical aspect, but they're also numinal or kind of spiritual, and that's because they've returned to that primitive nature. And lots of these primitive cultures, you weren't doing it as necessarily a decorative art so much, it was metaphysical. It helped you understand your philosophical beliefs within metaphysics and your spiritual beliefs. So as the artist has returned to that, the artist has returned back to their original role as a myth maker. as a maker of gods. Interpret that the way you will, that's what he thinks artists should be doing. But the one thing too is about this art being a myth maker or a maker of gods, it doesn't necessarily need to have utility. It doesn't need to serve a purpose. He thinks that idea in and of itself is a Marxist idea, and he hates Marxism. One of his interesting notions, one of his short writings in here, is on the death of Arshile Gorky. Arshile Gorky was a surrealist. He kind of bridges the gap between surrealism and abstract expressionism. It's quite interesting. He was an Armenian American who was quite disturbed. He witnessed his mother starve to death because of the Armenian genocide carried out by the Ottoman Turks in the early 1900s. He moved to America, got married, had a couple kids. He got in a car accident and his painting hand was like damaged beyond repair essentially, and so he killed himself. Newman's writing on this is that rejecting this Marxism, but the idea that it needs to be useful, is that to truly be aesthetic, you need to be useless. What's moral is useless, and what's useless is aesthetic. So the most useless thing you can do, and thereby be the most moral and aesthetic thing, is killing yourself, like Gorky did. And so that's also an interesting thing. I don't know if that's been elaborated on so much. It's pretty short, but it's an interesting idea that self-destruction is the most moral thing to do and the most aesthetic thing to do, according to Barnett Newman. But ultimately, with Newman, it comes down to this spontaneity. When you see that, you don't necessarily think spontaneity. You might think more along the lines of Kandinsky or his contemporary Jackson Pollock. He was a fan of doing art a primo, just spontaneous, and that kind of goes in line with his views on anarchy. He thinks that anarchy with no forms of government means that the forms of government that are established, because that's obviously gonna happen regardless, is that it should be spontaneous, that communities should be formed spontaneously, naturally, and that's the way he thought that art should be as well. I hope that gives you a better idea of Barnett Newman and his philosophy. Obviously, it was very important to him, and his ideas are really interesting. Like I said, a lot of them aren't necessarily explicitly connected to each other, but I think there are ways where they can quite easily be connected to each other, but some more than others. It just seems that, as far as scholarship is concerned, it's kind of nitpicked bits and pieces. But hopefully this has helped you at least get a better idea overall his philosophy, at least understand some of the thoughts that, and maybe understand his work, him, better. If you have any more specific questions about any of the things I mentioned, feel free to ask me in the comments. Also feel free to like and subscribe. Appreciate it. Another recommendation I could say again is just, I would encourage people, if you are really interested, to purchase this book. So that's all I have for you guys. This has been Shane with Unique Arts, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.